This will be a long episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and our selection for this episode of Real History hardly requires any introduction. Tonight we are going to be analyzing Steven Spielberg's visceral World War II blockbuster, Saving Private Ryan. This is a much honored and much beloved film of American cinema that redefined the concept of the war film itself. And there have been all sorts of cinematic and artistic breakdowns of especially the opening scenes of Omaha Beach, and a lot of those offer really great commentary and insight. What we are going to attempt to do in this episode is that we are going to try to do a little bit of separating of fact and fiction, and above all else, I am going to be trying to offer some historical commentary about the means of inspiration for the film. What are some of the historical elements that we should be taking into consideration? Could the film have done better in certain circumstances? And so on and so forth. And so this is going to be a very rich discussion that we're going to have, and let's not waste any more time. Let's go ahead, dive right in, take a look at Saving Private Ryan. I'll preface everything by saying this movie came out when I was in 4th grade, and it was just around the time that I was really starting to develop a true affinity for the study of history. And by the time I was in 5th grade, I knew I wanted to be a historian. I suspect this film played no small role in developing that. I've visited the cemetery at Normandy, at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach on a number of occasions. This scene here is one of the few moments in the entire movie that was actually filmed in Normandy, and it is just such an immensely humbling place. There are nearly 9,400 Americans buried here who were killed in the Normandy campaign. The expression of the elder veteran walking in here just says it all in so many ways. I'll also say, too, that Spielberg, being the master filmmaker he is, really knows how to play on the heartstrings. And, you know, some film critics and historians say that, you know, these opening and closing scenes are a little bit out of sync with some of the harsh realities, perhaps, that we see throughout the rest of the film, and we'll be revisiting that thought closer to the end. Just to give you a sense of human perspective, the size of this cemetery just seems so immense and overwhelming when you walk into it. And even more so when you consider the fact that these 9,400 individuals account for only 2% of the total number of Americans killed in the Second World War, and even a more minuscule number of the 65 million people killed in the Second World War. And so it's a really staggering thing when you consider it in that sort of numerical light. Despite what the opening caption here says about Dog Green Sector, Charlie Company of the 2nd Ranger Battalion actually landed in Charlie Sector of Omaha Beach. And Captain James Miller, Tom Hanks' character, is not a real-life individual. The real-life captain of Charlie Company was a 24-year-old officer by the name of Ralph Goranson. And he had absolutely, you know, no delusions as to just how tough a job that his mission was going to be. His battalion commander, James Earl Rutter, said to him that you're going to have the toughest goddamn job of the invasion on your hands. And indeed he did, perhaps. And unlike Hanks's character, he actually lived to the year 2012. And so if you want to have a kind of an authentic image in mind, Picture Tom Hanks circa 1980, and you probably have a better approximation of what Ralph Goranson may have looked like. As we're introduced to Captain Miller here, we can see, of course, captain's bars on his helmet. The idea of whether or not an officer landing on Omaha Beach with the 2nd Ranger Battalion would actually designate his rank, because, you know, if your rank is easily identifiable, you're going to be a better target for a German opponent. But this was kind of decided at a company level. There were, you know, some officers in some companies who decided to cover up their markings. There were others, though, who thought that being easily identifiable as an officer was an important facet of their leadership once the men reached the beachhead. And so obviously we see here that Captain Miller has opted to go that leadership route. Seasickness was quite prevalent for troops who were hitting the shore, and this not only had to do with the immensely choppy waves and, of course, the nervousness and tenseness of the situation, but as a lot of these men had gotten up hours before the crack of dawn in, you know, the mess galleys and the cooks and whatnot on the various naval vessels that they were on, wanted to give these guys a good rich meal, because they realized that for a lot of them it would be their last meal, and they wanted to feed them well. And so a lot of these GIs who were hitting the beaches, they were getting served, you know, eggs, sausage, bacon, really, really greasy stuff. And when all of that is sloshing around in your stomach with, you know, 5-foot waves, creates a little bit of, shall we say, consternation in your gut. And hence why a lot of men were vomiting as they were hitting the shores. As we see the U.S. sailor here as well, this is one of the inaccuracies at the outset of the film, because the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were actually taken ashore by British sailors, members of the Royal Navy. And believe it or not, contrary to what this film may suggest, British and Commonwealth troops comprised both 65% of the naval forces as well as the land forces on D-Day, including taking these American Rangers ashore on LCAs. In my mind, historically speaking, this is one of the great shortcomings of the film, not necessarily just in regard to this scene, but in the movie as a whole, because D-Day was really this international coalition, this idea of international togetherness to defeat Nazi Germany here on the shores of France. And you see no service members from any other Allied countries in the entire movie. And they could have very much been, you know, fixed in little moments like this. So it is what it is, though. As we see the ramps go down here, I'm reminded of so many of the first-hand accounts that I've researched and read and written about in my book, Dispatches of D-Day. And one that I thought it was particularly fitting to share with you, that I thought matched the intensity of this moment, is that of a Coast Guardsman who was shuttling GIs to shore, a guy by the name of Herman Fulton, Jr., who was from Atlanta, Georgia. And about a month after the invasion, a letter that he wrote home appeared in an Atlanta newspaper, and a portion of it had this to say: "It was a pitiful sight seeing men topple over the water before us, but still our soldiers pressed forward, fighting as they went. The sound of this concentrated ballet barrage peppering the sides of our boat and watching the 88s roll overhead was the most terrifying experience we've ever had." And indeed, this is the sort of chaos that Spielberg is trying to represent in these opening scenes, and he does so quite effectively. As we briefly get the German perspective here from the machine gun emplacements at the top of the bluff, I'm reminded of a number of things. First and foremost here, another little thing that the movie gets wrong, it can't control Mother Nature, of course, but the tide is far too high in these opening scenes. Now, in a lot of its Mediterranean operations, the United States military had landed its troops at high tide, the idea that they will have less beach to run. But because of the thick concentration of beach obstacles and so on and so forth, it was opted for Operation Overlord, that the troops would land at low tide. And so in contrast to a few dozen yards of beach that we see here in this so-called murder hole that Captain Miller was warning his men about, in reality it would have perhaps been several hundred yards of sand, an even more terrifying prospect for the men who actually landed on Omaha Beach on June 6th. I'm also reminded of the exploits of one of the German defenders who was manning a machine gun, an MG-42, much like we see here in these opening scenes, a German gunner by the name of Heinz Severloh, who with several 100,000 rounds of ammunition perhaps struck down many hundreds of Americans who were swarming ashore on Omaha Beach. And so the intensity here cinematically is just beyond belief, and it certainly left me awestruck the first time I saw it, as was the case for a lot of World War II veterans who saw it in theaters upon its release in 1998. The concrete bunker here that we see at the top of the bluff, there's really not a bunker that actually looks like that on Omaha Beach. What we see here is a cinematic mashup, kind of a monster mashup of different types of German fortifications. A lot of them would have been a little bit more hidden. The one here is very pronounced against the skyline. That would have been a very ripe target for the Allied air forces. But you know, the one here, I believe, is supposed to be a cinematic representation of what is known as Widerstandsnest 62, or perhaps Stand 72. And more often, a lot of these larger concrete bunkers would be facing down the beach, pointing down the length of the beach rather than across the beach. And then that way they could inflict greater triangulation of fire, and they could hardly miss any of the Americans as they were coming ashore as a result. But if you go to Omaha Beach looking for this bunker, you won't be able to find it, even if you can find it in a lot of subsequent video games that come out after this movie. Although it's not scientifically possible to be shot underwater like this, the movie does show men accurately drowning. Operation Overlord could have as very well been called Operation Overload. A lot of these men had 80, 90, 100 pounds of equipment. To make matters worse, they had not been given proper instruction on how to properly inflate their life belts. I have an example of one such life belt here. This is an actual one from the World War II years. You can see it being recreated and worn here as a costume prop in various scenes of the film. And it is inflated by CO2 canisters here in the front. The problem is that men had worn these around their waist rather than under their armpits, and when they inflated them in the water, they became top heavy. They flipped over in the water, and their legs were dangling out of the top of the surf as a result. And it's in the realm of possibility that these life belts killed as many American GIs on D-Day as they saved. And so the idea of American soldiers drowning here as they're trying to work their way ashore is dreadfully accurate. To recreate the sounds of bullets hitting flesh, military advisor Dale Dye actually went out to a shooting range, and he put small microphones into large pieces of meat. and they would shoot at them and capture the sounds accordingly. And so the sound, the cacophony of battle in this film is definitely spot on in this regard. As we see this carnage unfold and men being blown apart, I'm reminded of the experiences of a young Jewish soldier, a kid who was a gifted baseball player by the name of Harold Baumgarten, who was a member of the 29th Infantry Division, and he stepped on mines. Part of his jaw was blown away. The flaps of his cheek were blowing in the breeze. There was no way that he should have survived his ordeal on Omaha Beach. He later undergoes, over a dozen reconstructive surgeries, and then becomes a doctor because he wants to help people in the same way that individuals helped him. And so that's just one of many, many stories of gallantry that we can find on Omaha Beach. One of the cutting-edge elements about Janusz Kaminski's Academy Award-winning cinematography is that it really gives us a boots-on-the-ground perspective in a way that previous war movies had not. And what Steven Spielberg did is that he gave Kaminski war correspondent Robert Capa's 11 photographs from Omaha Beach. And these are iconic photographs that shows these waterlogged, overworked soldiers desperately pushing their way ashore. And there are some shots in these opening scenes that look, replicated verbatim almost from Capa's photos. And so you can see how those sorts of primary sources really leave a mark on this artistic recreation. The large log beach obstacles were known as Rommel's asparagus. And the whole philosophy behind all of this is that there would be teller mines attached to the top of them. And the Germans anticipated if the Allies were to land in this vicinity, they would land at high tide, as they had done in the past. They wouldn't be able to see these underwater obstacles. They would hit those logs and detonate the mine. And so the movie has those shown in here, but most of them are in fact facing the wrong direction. They are meant to go the other way. There was the belief that the boats would go up the ramp accordingly, created by the logs. And so I believe that this was caught at the last minute. The filmmakers tried to correct some of them, but they weren't able to correct them all. And a lot of people think the water turning red was a theatrical liberty taken on Spielberg's part, but there are first-hand accounts that indicate this exactly, that there were sections where the casualty concentration was so high that the water did in fact turn red. As we see an enlisted man asking Captain Miller, "What do we do now, sir?" We can see the blue and gray patch of the 29th Infantry Division on his sleeve. And indeed, in this sector, men of the 116th Infantry Regiment, which were part of that division, landed here in this spot. And so it wasn't just Captain Miller's Rangers who were landing here. The much larger contingent were infantrymen, and then further on down the beach were men of the Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division. This shot is just so unbelievable. These men wading ashore. It's just like out of a newsreel from 1944. It never ceases to amaze me. As there are these demands to make way for the others, this was a very much a real-life imperative on the minds of officers like Captain Miller as they were swarming ashore, because whether or not you moved forward as an individual or as a squad or a company, that conveyor belt behind you still continued to move, and the subsequent waves, the second, third, fourth, fifth, they were still going to be coming ashore whether you moved or not. And if you did not move forward, there would be such a high population of American troops at the end of the beach that would only make things more dangerous. And so because of everything going on behind you, you had to momentarily erase from your mind everything that was happening in front of you. And that's what made this situation so scary in the minds of so many.
What are you guys? 104th Medical Battalion, sir! Here to set up field operations!
Men of the 104th Medical Battalion were in fact on Omaha Beach in some of these opening phases. The first 3 of them landed with the 116th Regiment, but they were not carrying typewriters. They were carrying litters and bandages and all of the medical equipment necessary. And they certainly did not put those items down to pick up weapons or ammunition or anything like that, because these medics were desperately needed.
Operations! Get rid of that crap! Grab yourself some weapons! Follow me!
As an interesting side note here too, the typewriter that's being carried by this one, presumably a medical clerk, is an absurdly big one. Like, we're talking like a ledger book typewriter. This is not the sort of field typewriter that your average clerk or war correspondent would be carrying out in the field. And of course, the size, the magnitude of the typewriter is a cinematic device that's being used to illustrate the absurdity of this situation. So I suppose it works. Now, all that being said about a typewriter, there were in fact typewriters on Omaha Beach, because there were actually war correspondents who were going ashore in some of these opening waves. A little bit ago, I had mentioned Robert Capa, and another person that I'd like to introduce you to is a guy by the name of Jack Thompson, who wrote for the Chicago Tribune. And this is what he had to say on this very point. He said, "At the shore, bodies washed back and forth in the surging surf. I dropped my typewriter at the top of the 8-foot shingle ridge, then slipped back down to haul up a couple of soldiers who showed some signs of life. I left them with the medics who, seemingly oblivious to the constant steel rain, were draining blood plasma into the veins of so many young men with yellowish faces." This is an incredible first-hand account, and Spielberg very well just as could have put a reporter in this sort of situation as much as a clerk from a medical battalion.
Navy Beach Battalion, sir! I gotta clear these obstacles! Make holes for the tanks!
Sailors of the 7th Naval Beach Battalion, as we see here, were in fact on Omaha Beach, and clearing obstacles was only one of their obligations in this very desperate hour. They would also oversee the repair of small watercraft, the evacuation of wounded. They could sometimes act as traffic cops, much like MPs would on the beachhead. Their tasks were very, very multifaceted. And clearing beach obstacles with demolition charges would be only among a small number of them.
All the armor is foundering in the channel! Order, sir! You go somewhere else! I'm clearing this one! Come on, Briggs!
The idea of all of the armor floundering in the channel defies what is just a few feet away from Captain Miller, because as he is dragging Frank, his lieutenant, his XO, in the subsequent scene, you can actually see a Sherman tank in the background, slowly inching its way up the beach. And indeed, there were 15 Sherman tanks, duplex drive tanks, DD tanks as they were often referred to, that had these flotational devices, these flotational rings going around them, these tall exhaust vents going out the back so seawater wouldn't get into the engines. 15 of them had been aimed for this vicinity. A lot of them got stuck in the water. Some of them did sink. But 3 of them, in fact, were able to make it up the beach. And so not all of the armor is floundering in the channel. And if you look closely enough in the background, you can see an Easter egg, and you can actually see one of those Sherman tanks moving upward. These brief moments of shell shock that sound like the sea or a wind tunnel, I think are very evocative. Something likewise that had never really been done or experimented with in war films before. And it certainly speaks to the disorienting nature of combat. Things are naturally greatly condensed here from a time perspective. Here in less than 10 minutes, the Rangers are able to reach the shingle at the base of this bluff. In reality, it took the Rangers over an hour just to get that far. And there were some sectors on Omaha Beach where men were under fire for upward of 6 or 7 or 8 hours. And so it was just all-consuming vortex.
Shore party!
First wave, ineffective. We do not hold the beach. Say again, we do not hold the beach.
The radio man is also in Band of Brothers, if I remember correctly. So it's a little bit of shared universe here after all.
Cat aft.
A student one time asked me what CADAF means, and what that stands for is Commander Amphibious Task Force. And so yet again, one of these other sort of managerial positions in the combat zone, if you will, of people who are responsible for the funneling and placement of troops who are going ashore. One of the other hidden bits that are often overlooked as the medics are taking care of wounded men, you can see one of them gets hit and the bullet goes through his canteen, blood spurts out of the canteen, his own blood, and then he's there shoving a Carlisle bandage down his pants, caring for himself, as was sometimes the case with wounded men on Omaha Beach.
Not enough. It's not enough.
Dog 1 exit. It's got to be that cut on the right, or is it the one on the left?
No. Deerville is to the west of us. This is Dog 1.
The Dog 1 exit, also known as the Verville Draw, was one of these crucial geographic components of the means of cracking the safe, so to speak, on Omaha Beach. And you really don't get a sense of it in the film. Then, like today, the Verville Draw was a paved road leading up out of the beach here at the Dog 1 exit. And, of course, having a paved road going off the beach was considered prime real estate for the American service members who would, of course, need that existing infrastructure to carry troops, weapons, tanks, and everything else imaginable off the beach once the beachhead was established. And so you really don't see that sort of paved road or anything like that. And it only gets this very brief nod in the film. But tactically speaking, everything hinged on control of that road. In these opening elements, the Germans were kicking the snot out of the Americans. The round 1 is clearly a German victory. But, ultimately, the Germans, they don't have enough reinforcements, they don't have enough manpower to just withstand this huge numerical advantage that the Americans had on the beachhead. And so really it was only by the imposition of their own will and numbers that the Americans were able to overcome this really horrible bloodbath here at the Verville Draw.
Keep it moving.
Jesus! Come on. Lucky bastard. Move it. Keep it moving.
Survival on the battlefield, as we think of this bullet ricochet here, the game of chance is just so high, and soldiers would play these mind games, if I had just moved a foot to the left or the foot to the right, what might have happened. It certainly scenes like this are reminiscent of that.
Bangalores! Clear the shingle! Fire the hole! Fire low!
Bangalore torpedoes could have the potential to blow a 20-foot wide hole in an obstruction or a minefield like this. And, they were used not only to clear a path, as we see depicted here in Saving Private Ryan, but also to, clear any of those underground explosives that American soldiers might otherwise step on. They were used in fairly significant number here on the beachheads. And you can also see other cinematic representations of this being used in other D-Day films, such as Darryl F. Zanuck's The Longest Day, and also Sam Fuller's The Big Red One.
You're not gonna die. You're not gonna die. You're fine.
As we see the heroics of Medic Wade here, I'm reminded of the real-life circumstances of a medic who was in the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion by the name of Waverly Woodson, who was an African-American from Philadelphia, and despite being grievously wounded himself, continued to literally crawl from wounded man to wounded man on Omaha Beach in order to ensure their care and their hopeful recovery. And this was an individual who was potentially up for consideration for the Medal of Honor, but like so many other African-American soldiers, was denied that honor on account of the color of his skin. And in more recent years, there has been an effort to get him that recognition that he so very much deserves. It would have been really great to include somebody like Waverly Woodson here in these scenes, as well as his comrades who were manning the barrage balloons to protect Allied service members from strafing German aircraft. Incidentally, these scenes were shot in the south of Ireland. None of these battle scenes were actually shot in Normandy itself, and that is because the beaches at Normandy are a historic protected landmark, and movies tend to be rather destructive, especially war movies, so it's certainly understandable in that sort of context.
Two MG-42s, two mortars.
For as trite and small as this may seem, we see GI ingenuity unfolding here with Captain Miller's use of a mirror and an M1 Grand bayonet being used here in this scene. And you may be wondering, why would he even have a mirror on him, or why would somebody have a mirror? Well, this was part of your basic hygiene kit, because soldiers were required to shave every day, and even as they were in the Normandy hedgerows in the week after this, soldiers diligently shaved because it was one of the few means in which they could feel clean for a time. And as to the bubble gum, American soldiers always had bubble gum. And as one German prisoner later said, he said Americans were chewing on bubble gum as frequently as cows were chewing on grass.
Marks! You're next! Just hand a blindfold, Cap. All we can do here is die! Covering fire!
The words that all we can do here is die, very reminiscent of Colonel George Taylor's words to his men of the 1st Infantry Division, saying that there are only two types of men who are going to stay on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. And that was used as this sort of rallying cry to urge men to push up the beach. And likewise, in another sector of Omaha Beach, we see the likes of Norman Dutch Coda, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, a Brigadier General who went ashore And, he essentially, motivated the Rangers to move forward, essentially insinuating Rangers lead the way. Hence the motto that Army Rangers go by, even into the present. As we see the MG-42 position, once again, maybe a little bit anachronistic. They probably wouldn't have silhouetted themselves against the top of the ridge in such a pronounced way. If you go to the D1 area today, you can see these small bunkers and dugouts in the sides of the cliff. You can go walk through them in some circumstances. This is very, very pronounced by contrast.
All my strength, hasty to help me.
As we see Private Jackson sniping out the Germans here, you'll may notice that on his right thumb it is discolored, it is bruised, and a lot of people have wondered over the years, does he have what is in fact called the M1 thumb? As American service members and, reenactors or weapons collectors today, if you close the bolt improperly on your M1, it'll close on your thumb and it will give you that mark, that distinction, the M1 thumb. And it just so happens that one of our loyal fans of real history, a great guy by the name of Maurice Lazy Mo Sherman, a veteran himself, wrote to Barry Pepper inquiring this very question. Did you have the M1 thumb as you were filming all of this? And it just so happened that Barry Pepper wrote back to Mo and was able to confirm something for us. And Mo, being the great guy that he is, actually sent the original letter to us from Barry Pepper. And so, here it is on his actual letterhead. And so, Barry wrote to Maurice, "Thank you for your thoughtful letter, much appreciated. You have quite the eye for detail, spotting my M1 thumb. Very few people would catch that. Kind regards, Barry Pepper." And so we can confirm right here, written in his own hand, that yes, Barry Pepper had an M1 thumb as he was filming all of this. And it gets better too, because also enclosed was an autographed photo of Barry Pepper in this very moment. And so thank you so much to Maurice, one of our loyal fans, for sending us this, as well as a great collection of books from his library that we are definitely going to put to good use in this channel. So, Mo, this one's for you.
God, I'm hardly sorry for having offended thee. I detest my sins for having offended thee, O Lord.
As we see the chaplain here, another question that begs to be asked is, were there in fact chaplains here in the opening moments of D-Day on the beaches? And the short answer is yes. And I was able to find one really great little account from my research of D-Day era newspapers. And one includes the exploits. This is a newspaper article of Chaplain Julian S. Ellenberger, who was in the 4th Infantry Division, and that's the division that my grandfather was in when he went ashore on D-Day on Utah Beach. And this article says the chaplain was Julian S. Ellenberger of Greenwood, South Carolina, who went ashore on D-Day only 30 minutes after the initial assault troops. Besides administering spiritual aid to the wounded and dying, Chaplain Ellenberger assisted in establishing and maintaining a first aid station on the beaches under intense enemy fire, and despite slight wounds from shell fragments, remained at the station until it was demolished. And for doing that, Chaplain Ellenberger was awarded the Silver Star, rightfully so. With this great sort of bird's eye view shot looking down on the beach, Right beside some of the coastal fortifications, you can see men wiggling their way up this very, very narrow path. And I think that this is supposed to be the Verville Draw. And so if you look at photographs and footage, and even from back then, you can see that it's a lot more substantial than shown here.
Doyle! Do it! Don't shoot! Let him burn!
To my knowledge, there were no flamethrowers used here, at least in this sector of Omaha Beach. This is a pure creative license on the part of the filmmakers, and who can blame them? Because it is just stunning. It looks apocalyptic. It is literally and visually consuming in so many regards, and of course it leads to this very iconic line delivered by an embittered GI of "Don't shoot, let 'em burn." And I think this is a very revealing line because it's one of many bits of dialogue that we see in the movie here that I think chips away at a myth of the World War II soldier, the idea that they were always kind of, cute teenage guys, who drank milkshakes and were really innocent and religious. And well, no, combat has the ability to bring out both the good and the bad in individuals. And somebody expressing a sentiment like "let 'em burn" is something that is very evocative and accurate to the moment. These three nearly back-to-back scenes showing American soldiers executing would-be enemy prisoners, I think, is likewise very revealing. The likes of which, additionally, not something typically shown in American war movies. There was this previous notion, an inaccurate one, that Americans were somehow above murdering prisoners. And Americans, they were very vengeful, whether they were amphibious troops or whether they were paratroopers. And there is ample evidence to indicate that these sorts of things happen, and they're incredibly ugly, they're uncomfortable, they should make us uncomfortable, but such was the reality of war in this all-consuming nature as it was here around the beachheads.
What? I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're saying!
The other thing to take note of here, too, is that these seemingly German men who are attempting to surrender are, in fact, not speaking German. They are Czech. And this may seem rather quizzical at first glance. But in reality, perhaps as many as 1 out of every 5 German soldiers who were manning the coastal defenses in Normandy were, in fact, conscripted troops from other countries. They included Georgians, Cossacks, Poles. There were even a few Koreans whose story requires a whole other video, who were captured by Americans. And so these units were known as Ost battalions or East battalions. They were troops captured from Eastern European or even Asian countries in some circumstances. And, 3/4 of, German ground forces were fighting on the Eastern Front at this time. And so a lot of the German troops who were stationed in Normandy, they were not the cream of the crop in many circumstances. The cream of the crop had been dead for 3 or 4 years by this point. But it really speaks to the diminished nature of the German military by the time we get to the spring and summer of 1944. It also speaks to the massive ideological contradiction that the Germans had to conscript slave soldiers from other nationalities and of different ethnicities to fight for their supposedly superior empire, racially speaking. And so this is a scene that speaks to a lot of things, but it ultimately just shows how ugly war is.
What'd he say? What'd he say? Look, I washed for supper.
One of the German units that was largely comprised of foreign conscripts was the 716th Infantry Division. That's one prime example that I can think of, and certainly they were not alone. The large bunker with the coastal gun that we see jutting out of it here that's being taken out by a rifle grenade is, once again, you're not going to find any bunker that actually looks like that in either the Dog Green sector or the Charlie sector of Omaha Beach. This looks a little bit more like something that you would find at the Crisbeck Battery that is located near Utah Beach. And the Crisbeck Battery is going to come back into our story in a really profound way a little bit later on, so hang tight for more insight on that. But, in the meantime, this is a large coastal gun emplacement, and in reality, it would be nowhere this close to the water's edge. Here, it's a few dozen yards from the top of the bluff. If you visit the real Crisbeck Battery, or one like it, many of which are open to tourists today, these are often located over a mile inland from the shoreline. That gave them a wide, range of fire to an extent. They could be more easily concealed and camouflaged. It would be harder for, Allied planes and ships to spot it, so on and so forth. But it's certainly really imposing looking, and you can hardly blame the production designers for wanting to put something big and massive like this here, because it really says, oh crap, like look at, what they were looking down the barrel of here as they were working their way up the beach. So it's a very forgivable offense, historically speaking.
Look at this, a Hitler Youth knife.
And now it's a Shabbat holocaust, right?
The invocation of Judaism here, I think, is a really powerful one. And I think there's some connective tissue here, historically speaking, with a film that Spielberg made 5 years prior to this, Schindler's List, of course. I do in some way see these films as companion pieces as Spielberg was revisiting the 1940s. But I'm even more so reminded of, once again, a Jewish soldier who I mentioned earlier who was on Omaha Beach with the 29th Infantry Division, Harold Baumgarten, who was not shy in demonstrating his religious faith because he in fact painted a large yellow Star of David on the back of his M1941 uniform jacket. He wanted the Nazis to know exactly who he was and exactly who they were fighting. And so you see that sort of spirit of perseverance, even in the face of really ugly anti-Semitism, which was common of the age. The idea of Sergeant Horvath putting dirt or sand from his various campaigns in tin cans and putting them in his haversack, it's something that tourists today do, but it's not something that your average GI during the Second World War would have done. I mean, that's ultimately, it's just extra weight that you're carrying around. And if you were a soldier in the 2nd Ranger Battalion, you learned to trim as much extra weight as possible as you were going around. But thematically, it works because it shows that at least some D-Day combatants had been around before, that this war was ongoing for a while. But all that said, for the vast majority of American D-Day veterans, June 6, 1944 was in fact their first taste of combat, especially if you were a ground soldier.
That's quite a view.
Yes, it is.
And it remains quite a view to this very day. As I often encourage people Watching a movie or reading a book, it pales in contrast to going and actually visiting these places. Producer Andy and I have had the opportunity to go trek the Normandy battlegrounds with friends and family. It's just such a unique and humbling experience to go to these places, check them out for yourselves. And if you're ever looking for a unique historical place to go, you certainly can't go wrong with Normandy. As we see the crane shot, seeing the other Private Ryan, who's killed here on Omaha Beach, it's interesting to point out that the Dog Green sector, not too far away, was actually the first makeshift American cemetery, of which there would be several in the days that followed. But before we had this, beautifully manicured cemetery atop the bluffs of Omaha Beach, there were these more humble, ramshackle affairs where young American service members were being buried. And so it's rather symbolic when you think about it here. Although they had not gotten to film in actual Normandy itself, once the filming of these beach scenes had concluded, military advisor Dale Dye felt quite good about how these scenes turned out. And he said, we had the tiger by the tail, is how he phrased it. And I think he was right in the broad scheme of things. This sort of correspondence showing, condolence letters, the bureaucracy of death, which was very voluminous, as you can very well imagine. All of that was overseen and facilitated by the Adjutant General's office in Washington, D.C. And one of the other rather inaccurate things about this movie, which I think is one of the biggest historical stretches to be found in the film, is the very short amount of time in which notification of the deaths of these Ryan brothers is sent and discovered, from overseas back to the United States. It works its way through the chain of command. It works its way onto generals, so on and so forth. And then within 3 days, it's decided that we're going to hatch this rescue mission. It is simply impossible for such a thing to have happened at such a quick rate. When you look at the historical record, on average, American families were not notified of the death of a loved one in Normandy until around the 4th of July of 1944. And I know this because through my book research, I've read through hundreds of obituaries of these young men who were killed on the shores of Normandy around this time. And the Army bureaucracy simply did not move very swiftly in this regard. And so, it wasn't going to be till almost a month later that most families, such as Mrs. Ryan here, would be finding out this bad news.
Colonel, I've got something you should know about. Yes.
Now, of course, one of the interesting things here that we see in the Adjutant General's office is a wonderful little cameo by Bryan Cranston before he goes all Breaking Bad on us. And the absence of his arm, the fact that he's an amputee, certainly suggests that he has seen combat in this war. The one thing that doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense, though, is that he has a patch of the 2nd Infantry Division on his sleeve. And this doesn't quite make a whole lot of historical sense, because the 2nd Infantry Division did not deploy into combat in World War II until June 7th, 1944. And so here too, it's just another little thing. This is a minuscule nitpicking sort of stuff. But, you know, it's fun to point out nonetheless. And we have a channel, so why not talk about these things? So here we are.
Daniel, Ryan.
The three men are brothers, sir. I've just learned that this afternoon their mother's going to be getting all 3 telegrams.
The inspiration for this film is rooted in a true story. You know, screenwriter Robert Rodat was reading about the war in Western Europe, and he discovered the story of the Nyland brothers. And this became loosely the basis for the narrative plot of Saving Private Ryan. And so it is focused on 4 brothers, of course, and the first of which was Francis Nyland. And Francis Nyland was a member of the United States Army Air Forces. And he was shot down over Burma, a very overlooked and neglected theater of the war, at least in historical memory, about 3 weeks before the Normandy invasion. So we have one brother who is a POW being held by the Japanese. Next up, we have a second lieutenant by the name of Preston Nyland. And Preston Nyland was a member of the 4th Infantry Division's 22nd Infantry Regiment. And in fact, he was killed in combat around the Crisbeck Battery that I mentioned a little bit ago on June 7th, 1944. And so combat was still pushing inland at that time, and that's when and where he was killed. Sadly enough, only a few miles away, his brother Robert shared a similar fate. And Robert was in Company D of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment that was in the 82nd Airborne Division. And he was killed on D-Day itself. So we have one brother who's a prisoner, 2 brothers who are killed within 24 hours of each other around the time of D-Day. And that finally brings us to the final of the Nyland brothers, whose name was Fred, or Fritz Nyland. And Fred was an enlisted man in the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. And for all intents and purposes, Fritz Nyland is the basis for Private Ryan. And so how does Private Ryan's story deviate with Private Nyland's story? We'll be getting to that a little bit later in the film as well. Here in the window of the Ryan household, we see a service star flag. And of course, each one of those blue stars recognizes a member of that household who is currently in the service. And sadly enough, 3 of those 4 stars are soon to turn gold, being symbolic of 3 members of that household having been killed during the war. And while losing 3 family members in a war was not common, it certainly wasn't impossible either. But the scene of the farm here looks like nothing less than Norman Rockwell Americana, which is undoubtedly what Spielberg was going for. Now, one of the absolutely phenomenal Easter eggs, perhaps my favorite, in this movie, as the concerned Mrs. Ryan is going to the door to greet the chaplain and the clergyman, if we look to the right of the door, we see 4 young men in uniform all together, and presumably these are the 4 Ryan brothers. But lurking in the shadows, right there behind that group photo, if you look very closely, you can in fact see a portrait of Private Ryan, Matt Damon. And so we get a glimpse of him very, very vaguely here at the outset of the film. And so it's a great little hidden bit. Later on in the story, as Private Ryan is telling the story of Alice Jardine in the barn and, you know, all that fun that was happening, he said that moment of levity with his brothers was the last time that they were all together. Well, no, it's not the last time that they were all together, because they were obviously in uniform together here as well. So, you know, all these loose little ends that we can, nitpick and so on and so forth. But, we've seen this movie a lot of times. It's fun just to look at all of these things.
All four of them were in the same company in the 29th Division, but we split them up after the Sullivan brothers died on the Juno.
The 5 Sullivan brothers were killed on the USS Juno in the South Pacific on November 13th, 1942. They later had a ship named after them. Before the war was over, there was a movie made in their honor, a bit sappy at the end, called The Fighting Sullivans. And so the story of the Sullivans was very well known to the American people by the time we get to 1944, 1945. And, you know, to a lesser extent, newspaper reports of the Nyland brothers circulated in American periodicals, but certainly that of the Sullivan brothers was iconic in the American mindset. And it's, you know, altogether fitting that it comes up in conversation in this context.
We go sending some sort of rescue mission, flat-hatting throughout swarms of German reinforcements all along our axis of advance. They're going to be KIA too.
The white-haired colonel, who we of course see in this office scene, was in some ways, I think, like the power behind the throne in this movie. This is Captain Dale Dye, a United States Marine Corps veteran, who in the years after the Vietnam War went to Hollywood with a commitment and an ambition to get Hollywood filmmakers to show more accurate depictions of service members in film. And of course, one of his breakout successes in this regard was the 1986 film Platoon, in which he also acts. He acts in many of the movies that he also advises for. And it was his week-and-a-half boot camp prior to filming that prepared the core actors for this film to look, act, and think like a unit. And if you look at the DVD special features of Saving Private Ryan, you can see these various making of featurettes that include this boot camp. And Captain Dye was not done there either, because he was constantly on set. He was constantly devising sort of tactical scenarios that would play out throughout the film. And so, you know, for as much as this movie is heralded for a lot of its authenticity, a lot of the credit is due to Captain Dye. And so hats off to him for making this really one of the best war films ever produced.
I have a letter here, written a long time ago to a Mrs. Bixby in Boston. So bear with me.
The November 1864 letter written by Abraham Lincoln to Lydia Bixby of Boston is in fact a real historical document. And I really love its inclusion in this movie because in a lot of my research, I find a lot of connective threads between the Civil War and the Second World War. I see them as America's two necessary wars that posed existential threats to notions of freedom and democracy.
Laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln.
And I think it's very appropriate that Abraham Lincoln come up into conversation here as well. Now, the real story behind the Bixby letter is a little bit more complicated than this scene in the movie may imply. And of course, the letter becomes foundational for the rest of the movie, suggesting that we have a moral obligation to look after individuals and families who have given so much up in the name of their country. And Abraham Lincoln reiterates this in his second inaugural address from November of 1865, where he concludes, saying that, we must look after, those who have borne the battle and their widow and their children. This very magnanimous gesture we can see in these two Lincoln documents. As to the Bixby sons, though, not all 5 of them died. 2 of them died during the war. 2 of them deserted, and one of them, in fact, even joined the Confederacy. And then one of them was a prisoner of war. And so Lydia Bixby, still certainly lost a lot during the Civil War, but not near as half as much as the letter would suggest. In subsequent decades, it came under speculation of whether Abraham Lincoln actually wrote this letter, but his secretary, John Hay, did in fact confirm that Lincoln wrote this letter believing that the records on file were truthful, that this woman had indeed lost 5 sons on the field of battle, but as the paperwork got all caught up, it turned that the wherewithal was not entirely true. But it's still a wonderful letter written by Lincoln that also tells us a lot about the mindset of the 1940s as well. And so it's an aspect of this movie that I really enjoy.
The boy's alive. We are going to send somebody to find him. And we are going to get him the hell out of there.
And I just got to say, too, it's perfect casting for George C. Marshall because here's a guy who deserves to be depicted in movies. My argument would be that George C. Marshall could be considered one of the most important Americans, if not the most important American of the 20th century. One of the architects of Allied victory, head of the Marshall Plan, of course, which is named after him, European recovery after the war, becomes Secretary of State under President Truman. George Marshall is a guy that a lot more people should know about. And I'm glad he gets his due here in this film, for as trite or sappy as it may seem.
Have Charlie Company hold that Verville until we can get some armor up.
Yes, sir. Runner.
For as simple as it is, this scene showing staff members shaving, drinking coffee, eating thick sandwiches, I think says a lot without really any dialogue being spoken at all. And what it does is it speaks to the disconnect between frontline troops and rear echelon explicative, as the saying goes. Because, here is Miller, he spent the last 3 days, working his way through the hedgerows. He loses more men. And he, comes back to battalion headquarters, and there's men just indulging in luxuries that he and his men can't even possibly conceive of. And so it's this really nice little subtlety here that I think is speaks to a big truth about military life and culture.
We took out towed 88s here, and here. They'd already gotten 4 of our Shermans and a number of our Deuce and a Half.
One of the things I've always been curious about in this film, in the 3 days that have passed, you could have made a whole other movie about those 3 days, about what Charlie Company was doing, in the hedgerows beyond the beach. And I thought of that, some time ago. That's kind of like an interesting alternative movie that's a spin-off of Saving Private Ryan.
John, I've got another one for you. Yes, sir. This one's straight from the top.
I see Dennis Farina's character of Lieutenant Colonel Anderson as this sort of composite character who I think is supposed to be Colonel James Earl Rudder. because the 2nd Rangers, they were kind of scattered all over the place on D-Day. 3 of their companies scaled the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. Some more elements of them landed on Omaha Beach. These were elite guys, you know, just as elite and gung-ho as the airborne who were in the thick of it. But, you know, with, you know, Farina here, you know, he's about a decade older than what Rudder was. Rudder was 44 years of age during the time of the invasion. And, you know, and this speaks to another one of the historical problems that we often see in a lot of war films, and that's just the actors are too old. We see it in Fury, we see it in this movie, we see it in so many others, where you have people in their 40s and their 50s who should be portraying people in their 20s and their 40s. You know, Dennis Farina was a great actor. Loved him in Law and Order and so many other films. But he's just a little bit too old here. All that said, he was born in the year 1944, so perhaps there's some zeitgeist there after all.
You and I are taking a squad over to Newville on a public relations mission.
Well, you leading a squad?
Some private in the 101st lost 3 brothers and he's got a ticket home.
One of the things that I enjoy about this assembly area, repel-depel sort of scene in which Captain Miller is conveying the situation to Sergeant Horvath is that there's just this, there's this constant, you know, motion, you know, going on in the background. This is where those 1,000+ Irish extras are being put to good use, because this is true to form of how the roads coming out of the beachheads looked. You have multiple divisions that didn't fight on D-Day proper, but are coming ashore in the ensuing days to continue the momentum, to keep pushing, to keep the fighting going. And I absolutely love this scene because you really get a sense of scale. One area in which I think the 1962 D-Day movie, The Longest Day, exceeds and surpasses Saving Private Ryan is that it shows that sense of scale. Saving Private Ryan's a little bit more intimate. It's up close. It's ground level. We get more of a macro picture, especially in the number of people used in The Longest Day. And that's one area in which I think The Longest Day is a better film.
Jesus Christ. They took away your company?
It wasn't my company. It was the Army, so they told me anyway.
One really important thing for us to take into account, you know, when Captain Miller is lamenting here about his company being taken away from him, you know, if a search and rescue mission like this, you know, would have actually happened, which it did not, it would have made a lot more sense to give that duty to a corporal or a sergeant. You know, for that sort of squad level perspective, you know, a sergeant would have been running the show. And simply put, the likes of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, they could not afford to lose a living captain, a captain who was on both of his feet still 3 days after D-Day. Absolutely every officer was needed because the rate of attrition was so astronomically high among commissioned officers. There's no way that Captain Miller would have been sent off for this public relations mission to search for Private Ryan as such. You know, if we take, you know, the likes of Ronald Spears of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment into account, he killed one of his own belligerent sergeants in an act of self-defense, and not even he was rotated out of the company as a result. That is how desperately people of officer standing were needed at this given moment.
Thank you very much.
Is that a souvenir?
No, sir.
Take your time, Cole.
The mentioning of the German helmet as a souvenir speaks to a very real truth about GI scrounging, collecting, scavenging, and souvenir hunting in the Second World War. American soldiers were prolific at this, and whether it be alcohol, the finest French whatever, or captured German items, helmets and flags especially, were something that were highly coveted, that they could send home, put on their fireplace mantle, and show that they had not missed the big show. And of course, a lot of the Nazi artifacts that one can find in the world today are in the United States and not Germany, because so much of this loot and contraband was brought home by American service members after the war. And of course, they would often turn it into trench art. They would paint over them. They would do maps. They would write the names of their buddies on them. Everything under the sun. American soldiers would either ship, steal, or mail home. So definitely speaks to a truth here of GI life. I also very much enjoy this this final view of the beach that we have. We have LSTs, landing ship tanks, bringing troops and vehicles ashore. LSTs were the workhorse of the American military here on D-Day. They could hold dozens of tanks, dozens of vehicles, literally take items from ship to shore. It's nice that we get this kind of glimpse of this other aspect of the invasion, because in earlier parts of the film, oddly enough, we can't see any ships in the background. Now, granted, a lot of the biggest ships were circling 10 miles out from the shoreline. Perhaps that's why we couldn't see them. But acknowledging the fact that there is a Navy out there, that we do have barrage balloons floating over the beach, that the mines are being cleared, that troops are marching inward. It's a beautiful panoramic shot, almost as if it was from a 1944 photograph.
You want to explain the math of this to me? I mean, where's the sense of risking the lives of the 8 of us to save one guy?
20 degrees. Anybody want to answer that?
I think there's a lot to unpack in these conversations and showing small squad dynamics. First of all, not a very great tactical formation. One quick spray of a German machine gun would wipe out this entire squad, and Private Ryan would be up a creek without a paddle if that were the case.
There's not a reason why, there's but to do and die.
What the fuck is that supposed to mean, Corporal, huh? We're all supposed to die, is that it?
The other thing that I think is revealing from a narrative standpoint is that really there's nobody in this squad who is likable. And I think it speaks to the grating effect that the war has had on these men. At the same time, this, to an extent, is a very informal and easygoing conversation that these enlisted men are having with their captain, the dynamics of which I think in the very strict and rigid ranks of the 2nd Ranger Battalion perhaps don't really reflect reality in that regard. The idea of a private questioning the merits of a mission to his captain are shall we say, exceedingly rare here in regard to the historical record.
The God gave me a special gift, made me a fine instrument of warfare.
Griven, pay attention now. This is the way to gripe. Continue, Jackson.
Barry Pepper was one of the actors who was really committed to the boot camp idea. Not all of the actors were, and I believe Dale Dye had some difficulty in molding Tom Sizemore into a believable NCO sort of character. But Barry Pepper went up to Dale Dye, after boot camp, and essentially told him, he said, if I don't succeed in accurately portraying this character, I want you to know that that's not a reflection on you, but it's a reflection on me. And so, you have, some of these individuals who were really, really committed, taking seriously the roles that were entrusted to them. And some of them really excelled at it.
Oh, that's brilliant, Bumpkin. Hey, so, Captain, what about you? I mean, you don't gripe at all?
I don't gripe to you, Ryben. I'm a captain.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of smoking on patrol, talking loudly, Germans could be anywhere around the corner. They're very obviously moving through this terrain. They would have been a prime target for an ambush here in this highly fraught sort of terrain in which the Germans just reveled in ambushing troops in instances like these. So, yeah, but you have to advance the narrative somehow, and you have to have a little bit of character development. I wonder if there could have been an alternative way of doing it. Artistically, I absolutely love the juxtaposition of the rattle of battle overlaid with the drips of rain on the leaves and in the puddles. It's very reminiscent of a scene from Ken Burns' documentary Civil War series at the Battle of Shiloh. He shows petals falling from a tree at the Battle of Shiloh. And he very much does that same sort of thing here almost a decade before all of this. And certainly, Tom Hanks and Spielberg are big fans of Ken Burns. And I've always wondered if they got the idea for that from the likes of that documentarian.
We got stopped by some intense rifle action from the eastward. The Germans have been reinforcing 2 regiments all day.
I absolutely love Paul Giamatti as an actor. He's absolutely one of my favorite actors. But if he actually had ankles like an old woman, there's no way that he would have been a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne during the Second World War, because these guys were as fit as fiddles. And if you had ankle problems or you couldn't run, there was no way that you were going to cross the line and earn those jump wings accordingly.
Keep shooting him up like that! As long as his lungs have breath in him, he still carries the message. We do the same thing. No, we wouldn't! Wade! Get him ready to travel. Yes, sir!
I really like the fact that Captain Miller says, yeah, we do the same thing. You know, we shoot wounded men as well. We shoot, you know, these messengers. It underscores the moral gray area that war is. And it somewhat pulls us away from some of these greatest generation myths that all of these guys were like Captain America who had sublime morals, and that just wasn't the case. They were compelled to do extremely horrible things in the name of victory and survival, and until we come to terms with that, we will be detached from the reality of what the Second World War was.
You stay with Sergeant Horvath.
Stay right here. I'm wearing my underwear, Captain. Stay with me.
As the GIs are dodging their way through the rainy streets of Newville here, this recreated town is a fictionalized version of the real-life town of Neuville-au-Plain, which, as it would just happen to be, was the location of Robert Nyland's place of death on D-Day. And so here, once again, the real-life backstory of Saving Private Ryan intersects geographically with what we see depicted here.
Ryben, where's the captain from?
You figure that one out, you got yourself a nice prize.
$300 last I heard.
Company's got a pool. $5 gets you in.
I actually spoke to a veteran of the Irish Army once amidst my travels who was an extra, or at least he claimed to be an extra in this film. He seemed to have some pretty good details that I wasn't about to question. And one of the things is just how miserable a movie this was to shoot on the cold beaches of Ireland. A lot of the actors actually had, as far as he said, had wetsuits on underneath in order to protect them from hypothermia and constantly being wet and cold and whatnot. But he says, you know, a lot of the people did not have that sort of protective gear underneath their World War II uniforms, and it was just day in and day out of people being cold, wet, and miserable as they were recreating this even more horrific moment of the history of the Second World War. So there's one little anecdote from the set for you.
them if they know where the Germans are.
As you can very well imagine, the war inflicted a terrible toll on the French civilian population. Not only had they been occupied by this oppressive fascist regime for 4 years by this point in the war, but there was a terrible price that was paid for their liberation. Perhaps as many or more than 50,000 French civilians were killed as a result of Allied bombing in the weeks and months building up to the Normandy invasion. This was, as one French resident later attested, this is the price we pay. And indeed, they paid it in a very big and horrible way. One thing that I take issue with is kind of this singular interpretation that the film offers of French civilians. First of all, there's not enough French civilians in the film. Miller's squad would encounter them with far more frequency than what they do in the movie. But also, there's no agency, really, behind any of the mild French characters who we see in the film, because we would be remiss to neglect the fact that many of these French civilians had been fighting the Germans far longer than what these squads of Americans had. They had been waging a fierce resistance. Once the Americans arrived, they acted as guides, translators, informants, and you just don't get a sense of that, unfortunately, here in Saving Private Ryan. And in the same way that Commonwealth forces are omitted, you get no sense of the resistance or any of the brave work that those individuals were doing either. One of the things about the sniper in the church tower that's a bit off is that American artillery would have absolutely pounded that sucker into oblivion before any German could have occupied it in the way that we see here. Church steeples were a #1 target for artillerists for these very reasons. This is why so many of them have to be rebuilt in the years after the war. And so, you could say that, okay, the bullet doesn't go through the scope that way. It's pretty much a near impossible shot. But perhaps the bigger issue is, would there have been such a tower to begin with still in existence for the sniper to occupy?
We got him. Stay down.
I've never understood why he says, "We got him, stay down." If we got him, you can get up.
That's why we can't take children.
The whole dynamic here, though, it does go against the grain of Americans being liberators. Captain Miller's saying, we aren't here to do the right thing. We're here to follow orders. We aren't taking kids with us. It, once again, kind of goes against some of those popular perceptions of the war. And, never once in any of the conversations that the characters have do they talk about some sort of higher moral cause or patriotism or love of country or anything like that. They're constantly complaining. They're constantly at each other's throats. I think it's very accurate in this regard.
Jimmy T, go find Captain Hamill. Bring him in here.
What there?
How the hell should I know? Would you just go look, please? Thank you, you moron.
I love Paul Giamatti so much.
Grab my boot.
The scene with the stone wall falling, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that something like this could have happened. If you look at places like Carentan that were just turned into these huge heaps of rubble for the most part. This nature of urban warfare was very unforgiving, predictable. You never knew what was around the corner, who was in the next room or across the next wall. Something like this very well could have happened. It wouldn't surprise me in the least. Now, whether or not any of the troops on either side would have hesitated to shoot as they do here, I think is another question entirely.
Lieutenant, redeploy that bazooka to the right side of the road.
Yes, sir.
Get Ryan up here.
A nice aesthetic trait to Captain Hamill's uniform. You know, he mentioned that he's with the Pathfinders, and his uniform is painted with a rudimentary form of camouflage accordingly. And so that was a nice little bit of attention to detail on the part of the costumer.
You're James Ryan.
Yeah.
James Francis Ryan, from Iowa.
James Frederick Ryan, Minnesota.
I mean, there's several thousand guys in the 101st Airborne. It's a pretty common name. It's not impossible.
How the hell did you end up way up here?
You got me, sir. C-47 took heavy fire. Pilot went crazy trying to get out of there, turning every which way.
There were indeed a lot of busted ankles among the paratroopers on D-Day. When you have 100+ pounds of gear on you, you land in the dark, it is bound to happen. I read many first-hand accounts of things along those lines happening.
Well, we got the beachhead secure. Problem is, Monty's taking his time moving on con. We can't pull out till he's ready, so...
That guy's overrated.
Now, indeed, it took Sir Bernard Law Montgomery far longer to take con than what was anticipated by several weeks in actuality. But, you know, the fact that, you know, they were overly optimistic about their goals certainly doesn't suggest that their trials were a cakewalk either. And the fact that the sole reference to Commonwealth troops in this movie is a derogatory one, I think really diminishes and almost unfitful for what they were actually doing simultaneous with all this.
What was the name of that kid? That Anzio, the one that was always walking around on his hands, you know, and he was singing that song about the man on the fly trapeze.
You know, there's conversation in the film about, you know, Horvath and Miller, you know, fighting at Kasserine Pass and whatnot. But the only Ranger unit to fight at Kasserine Pass was the 1st Ranger Battalion. And so, and not many of them survived it either because it was a debacle of the highest order. And so the idea that they were one of the few survivors of the 1st Ranger Battalion at Kasserine, and then they were rotated to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, it's a stretch.
How did you get to be a ranger? He got shot in the foot once, didn't he, when he was walking on his hands? Yeah, he could walk faster.
The transcription of the blood-stained letter, I think, is a profound one. I can't think of any actual historical accounts where that happened, but what it does underscore is that it speaks to the sublime significance of written correspondence among service members to their families during the Second World War. You know, a lot of troops overseas today, you know, they have internet access, they are able to send emails, there can be some degree of verbal communication or digital communication in one form or another, but naturally, soldiers during World War II didn't have any luxuries like that, and written letters were the lifeline between the horrible present and the more comfortable past that they were seemingly further disconnected from. And so it's a nice little gesture here nonetheless to include it.
Stars. Yeah. Brigadier General Amend. Deputy Commander 101st.
The scene with the crash glider, I think, is likewise a very revealing one. The so-called General Amend, who is referenced here, is loosely based off of the real-life death of General Donald Pratt, who was actually the Assistant Division Commander of the 101st Airborne Division. And he was in a glider craft piloted by Colonel Mike Murphy. Their glider landed on a really wet and slick pasture outside the community of Heistville, which thereafter became a huge rendezvous and hospital and burial area for a lot of these misplaced men of the 101st Airborne Division, much like we see here in this scene. The circumstances of his death weren't because there was, you know, armor-plated flooring and, you know, and all that sort of stuff. But he was sitting in the seat of his Jeep that was inside the glider, and he was apparently not prepared for the violent whiplash of his glider landing in such a tumultuous way, and the whiplash snapped his neck as a result. So it was a very blunt ending here for him as a result, and he was the highest ranking American officer killed on D-Day as a consequence.
Ben Rubino, Mike Cesario. I swear all the guineas are buying that.
Oh, come on, Agni. We really winky, that's a buddy of yours.
This exchange with the dog tags, I think, is revealing in another way, because it shows us that even though these guys are only a few days into the campaign, they're already desensitized to this supreme amount of loss that completely engulfs them, to the point that they are joking about it. And so there's a lot of insensitivity in this scene, but you know, death was an everyday matter, and so I don't think it's an exaggeration that people may have been feeling this way at all.
Maybe we should bust up in a couple of different groups, huh? Wander the woods like Hansel and Gretel, calling his name. He's bound to hear us sooner or later. Ryan!
The idea of Captain Miller wandering around an assembly area like this, yelling out Ryan's name, I don't think is as far-fetched as it may initially seem. Because, you know, if this is supposed to kind of be the Heistville area, I mean, this was a huge converging point for the airborne. It makes perfect sense to just start yelling out a guy's name to see if you get a reply. So it's not a stretch at all.
Him, me, and a couple other guys were coming here to the rally point. Ran into a colonel who was gathering up men to go to, Rommel.
Rommel is actually a fictional town, but if it were along the Murderate River, it would actually be within the zone, the sphere of operation of not the 101st Airborne Division, but the 82nd Airborne Division. And one of the most iconic fights to take place in this vicinity among troops in the 82nd was the struggle for Lafayette Bridge, which a military advisor to this film, Del Dye, aspires to make into his own film to tell that story of the 82nd, which is neglected from this one. And so, yes, if Rommel were real, it would not have been occupied by Private Ryan's regiment.
The radar side. It's got to be out of action.
Oh, looks like we got something in that sandbag bunker right under the station.
One of the things that I've always wondered, if it's a decommissioned radar or radio station, why is it still even being manned by 3 or 4 Germans? I'm gonna need to go to the bathroom soon. Catch up.
All right, I have a real problem with this scene. Are you telling me that actual Rangers would ignore everything at their disposal, the terrain, and the fact that the enemy is completely unaware they're there? I have to do something about this. Jared, call your brother.
I'm with Robin on this one, sir. I mean, we left them 88s.
For the Air Force, the Air Forces are going to spin ordnance on one machine gun.
Oh yes, they will. They most definitely will spend ordnance on one machine gun position. They will go after anything. If our humble squad here had bothered to bring a radio with them, they could have called in for air support here, which they probably would have done in actuality. The scene just absolutely befuddles me. You have a sniper who could snipe at this machine gun position. There's no attempt at maneuvering. They're making an open assault across an open pasture with no cover. It just seems anathema to what Rangers would have actually done in a situation like this. Nor would it make sense to, at least in my mind, take the medic forward. But hey, you need some sort of device to kill off the medic for dramatic effect, so. For anybody wishing to hear our further thoughts on this scene in the film, stay tuned for a special breakdown that we will be having and airing here in the very near future here on Real History. I've always thought this moment with Captain Miller crying was Oscar worthy in and of itself. I do think Hanks should have received the Best Actor Oscar for this film. And I've always wondered, what was he thinking of in his mind, to cry on cue like this? It'd be a really interesting question to pose to him. But I think it speaks to this bigger issue about small unit leadership. Because, in a way, if you're a captain, you can't reveal your true self to your men. In a way, you can't show emotion because that has the potential of diminishing their confidence in you as a leader. And of course, he's already taken a punch to his confidence here with this poor tactical decision that he made. But man, it's such a well-acted scene, once again, in which nothing is said, but in so many ways it says everything.
Steamboat Willie. Dude. Betty Boop. What a dish. Betty Grable. Nice scams.
Steamboat Willie was Walt Disney's first release cartoon, came out almost 20 years prior to this, and even in the 1940s, Mickey Mouse was ubiquitous with American culture. And so it's not at all surprising that Mickey Mouse, another cartoon, Betty Boop, or actress Betty Grable, who is the German POW here, said has nice gams or nice legs. It's not surprising that he would try to make these overtures to his captors in the effort to try to build a sense of empathy with them.
I swear, I hope Mama Ryan's real fucking happy knowing that little Jimmy's life is a little bit more important than two of our guys. But then again, we haven't found them yet, have we? If
a real-life ranger in World War II were mutinous like this, he probably would have been shot on the spot. These sorts of antics were not tolerated in the real ranks of the Rangers.
I teach English composition in this little town called Abley, Pennsylvania. The last 11 years, I've been at Thomas Alva Edison High School.
There is no such place as Adley, Pennsylvania. There is a Hadley, Pennsylvania, in the western part of the state. Thomas Alva Edison High School is located on the other side of the state in the Philadelphia area, just in case you wanted to know.
If going to Ramel and finding him so he can go home, if that earns me the right to get back to my wife, well, then that's my mission.
Despite how many elements of this scene and the scenes preceding it are derailed from reality, I really do enjoy this confession of sorts on the part of Captain Miller, where he admits that the sole reason that he continues to push himself forward in fighting is not for any grand cause, not in the name of liberation or defeating fascism. He's fighting because he just wants to go home. The only way to get home is victory. This was a major motivating force for a lot of ground troops in World War II because, after all, a lot of them had signed up or been drafted for the duration, as their paperwork indicated. So that was a great catalyst for fighting like hell, doing your utmost, going after the enemy, because only by going after the enemy could you ultimately attain victory and, as Captain Miller says, get on that big boat going home.
Half track, cover!
And if I'm recalling correctly, I believe German half-tracks like this would have moved out in convoys and would not have been roving in solo fashion, much like we see here. So there would have been a much larger contingent of German troops with us, and thus much harder to defeat than what we see here.
Captain Miller, Charlie Company, 2nd Rangers.
Corporal Henderson, Easy Company, 501st.
Ryan, 1st to 506.
Now, I've had the chance to talk to a number of World War II veterans, all of whom have unfortunately since passed away, and their thoughts on this film. And this included both Rangers and paratroopers alike. The Ranger that I talked to, likewise a veteran of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, a gentleman who lived in my local area, who was a veteran of Pointe du Hoc, a veteran by the name of Sheldon Bear. I asked him once about Saving Private Ryan, and he said, the combat scenes were pretty good. They give you a sense of what it was like and what was going on, but he did take issue with the idea of Rangers going to rescue a paratrooper, and he essentially said we were nobody's errand boy. So, you know, the idea that they were going, you know, on this wild goose chase against another elite unit perhaps didn't quite rest too well with him. Likewise, I had the opportunity to talk on a number of occasions with Lieutenant Colonel Ed Shames, who at the time of this whole series of events was in the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, and he, of course, has been portrayed in Band of Brothers. Very similar to his Ranger brethren, he took issue with the idea that paratroopers needed saving in the first place. Because if you think back to the Bastogne mindset, it's ingrained in the popular imagination that Patton goes and saves the beleaguered 101st Airborne at Bastogne. That's certainly something that the paratroopers took issue with. Shames asked of me a rhetorical question. He said, they were going to send somebody to save us? Those two conversations offered really interesting dynamic perspectives on how these elite veterans saw a version of themselves being portrayed in this movie.
You got 3 minutes to gather your gear.
Sir, what about them? I mean, there's barely hardly enough of this.
2 of our guys already died trying to find you, all right?
And Matt Damon was famously omitted from the boot camp exercises before filming. Very smartly on his part, Spielberg wanted there to be this natural resentment of him as a person on the part of the other cast members. Some brilliant psychological maneuvering on his part, and that resentment, that bitterness, definitely comes through in these performances.
It doesn't make any sense, sir. Why? Why me? Why do I deserve to go? Why not any of these guys? They all fought just as hard as me.
These exterior scenes were shot on a British aerodrome. A Band of Brothers would be filmed there just a few years later. What we actually have here is some very clever production design on the part of the filmmakers. Because on one side of this artificial river that the crews constructed, we have Rommel, where we are currently, and then on the other side is the community of Neuville, where Caparzo lost his life earlier in the film. And so there's a lot of really good trick camera work to give you the illusion that you're in a different place, but in actuality, we, the audience, have already been here.
Someday we might look back on this and decide that Saving Private Ryan was the one decent thing we were able to pull out of this whole god-awful shitty mess.
In the second half of the film, I feel that there's a real departure from historical reality, and we get just into good old-fashioned storytelling. I think that's the best way I can sum it up. And so, you know, we'll probably be reflecting on, you know, some, you know, production elements as well as historical ones moving forward, I suspect.
You know, we could try a sticky bomb.
Sticky bomb, sir?
Sir, are you making that up?
No, it's in the field manual.
You know, a lot of the guys probably wouldn't have been as clueless on the idea of a sticky bomb as a lot of them appear to be here, because this was in fact a weapon that Rangers and probably paratroopers knew how to use, because it was included in the Ranger Handbook of Field Expedient Devices. That's a great title for a manual of that time period. Yeah, but truth be told, the paratroopers, much like the Rangers, they had been trained in every sort of weapon and destructive device imaginable, including those of the enemy as well. And so they probably wouldn't have been as caught off guard here by Captain Miller as it would seem.
Beyond all recognition, right? Got that right.
Contrary to what is implied throughout the film, the phrase FUBAR was not necessarily some insider phrase or joke that only combat veterans would be aware of. And just a little bit of prep work going into our episode here, I was able to find that phrase as early as February of 1944. Referenced in civilian American newspapers, no doubt. Now, quite naturally, the American newspapers did not use the actual F-bomb. It was often described as fouled up beyond all recognition, as it was for many Hollywood movies in the years prior to this one. But it probably would have been a better known phrase than what this movie might suggest. The song Tu es partout by Edith Piaf came out in 1941, a very sentimental, sorrowful romance song that was immensely popular to a lot of people of this generation. It's a fine piece to include here in our background soundtrack for the film. But it was a little bit of a side note. Edith Piaf sang songs during the war years as a means of fundraising that was used for various charitable causes. She was a supporter of the French resistance. She was, just some sideline entertainer. Like so many celebrities of the time, she took a very active role in whatever manner she could in the persecution of the war.
He's working on this bra and he's trying to get it off, and all of a sudden Sean just screams out, "Danny, you're a young man, don't do it."
Of course, one of the great stories about Matt Damon's casting in all of this is that Spielberg wanted a relative unknown actor to be cast in the role, and not anticipating Matt Damon's celebrity that happened the year prior to all of this, with him winning an Academy Award with Ben Affleck for co-writing Good Will Hunting. On top of that, speaking to Matt Damon's prowess as a screenwriter, this entire scene of he and his brothers was improvised, and despite that plot hole that we were talking about earlier, about that being the last time of him seeing his brothers, it's a pretty good story and a good homespun one to be made up on the fly.
Look, Rabbit, I don't need any luck, Sarge. I was born lucky.
The so-called Rabbit here, the treaded motorcycle, is a HK-101, and it could be used for reconnaissance in a manner that we see here, although it's certainly not as practical as just a regular German motorcycle, which were, of course, used in great quantity. There were more practical applications to it. It was often used to run field wire. You could hook up a hitch to it. It was really good to be used on the Eastern Front, in which, it was good for getting through the thick Russian mud. Now, from what I've read, this isn't how a German column would enter a town. It's very direct. There's little maneuvering. They're horribly all bunched up together. But as Spielberg was choreographing all of this, one of his chief concerns is that would he be able to make this last battle as intense as the first one in the movie? These battles bookend the film. They're roughly the same length of time. I get a sense that this one, although it's dramatic, it's exciting, it's bloody, there's uncertainty to it, it doesn't quite have the same historical chops as the first 25 minutes. That's just my take.
Infantry's moving to the left.
And once again, that bell tower would have been long out of commission. If ground troops or artillery wouldn't have gotten it, the American Air Force would have. The Tiger tank that we see here is actually a retrofitted Russian T-34 tank that was mocked up accordingly to be in the film, and that's understandable because there's only 5 or 6 Tiger tanks today that exist. They're incredibly hard and difficult and expensive to maintain. And of course, you want something that's somewhat disposable here in the film for good reason. If you want to see a real Tiger tank in action, you can check out the movie Fury. Tiger tanks, to an extent, although they had really powerful guns and can certainly knock out their share of more lightly armored American tanks, there were just a lot of operational problems with them. They were heavy, they were slow moving, and some more recent studies by historians suggest that for every 1 hour that a Tiger tank was in the field or in battle situations like we see here, it required a dozen hours of maintenance to recoup all that, to keep it operational. So for as big and bad as they seem, they definitely had their share of problems. The other thing about the tank to take into account is that there were no Tiger tanks in Normandy at this given time. Most of the heavy-duty armor, the really good stuff, was being used on the Eastern Front. The first of the Tiger tanks weren't arriving in Normandy until about a week after D-Day, and they certainly wouldn't have been deployed here to the front in the greater Cherbourg vicinity at this given time. What the Germans would have had would have been outdated, old, interwar era French tanks that they had captured and repurposed several years earlier. This Tiger tank, this rendition of it, is being used in the film simply because of its bad boy image. You know, that's one of the iconic tanks of the war. And who can blame the filmmakers for wanting to use this iconic bit, even if it's ahistorical? Oddly enough, the tank used in this movie made a very circuitous journey here to Pennsylvania, where I live. Some fellow Pennsylvanians may be able to chime in the comments to reinforce this, but there was a vehicle or a tank collector, South Central Pennsylvania, I think it was in the Dillsburg, Pennsylvania area. For a number of years, it was sitting alongside Route 15 on his property, and you know, thousands of people would drive by the tank every day, used in Saving Private Ryan, and I myself drove by it on a number of occasions. I also believe that some of my reenacting brethren have seen it be used in World War II reenactments here in the Mid-Atlantic region as well. I can't attest to where it is today, though. And here we just saw Germans, of course, murdering Americans, just as we've seen Americans do throughout this whole movie. And so it was very much tit for tat in this regard.
Ryan! Are you all right?
Get off of me! Yeah, I'm fine too, Captain. Thanks.
And of course, the weapon that Captain Miller fires throughout the film is this right here. Now, this is an earlier rendition of the type of Thompson submachine gun that Captain Miller is using. This is a 1928 model, but it looks very similar, and of course it works in the same sort of function as well. And much like Captain Miller, we have a 30-round magazine that slides right in accordingly. It was, of course, known as the Chicago typewriter during the gangster era because of the staccato sound that it would make when fired. And, you know, despite how sleek and iconic looking it is an incredibly heavy weapon. And it could really weigh down on your shoulders after you were carrying it across the front accordingly. You know, it's possible that somebody like Captain Miller would have carried something like this. A lot of Rangers, especially those of places like Pointe du Hoc, carried these into battle with them. Case more often than not, though, a lot of lieutenants, captains, and majors who went into battle often carried carbines with them. These were more lightweight, they were more mobile because, after all, an officer's primary function was not to be a rifleman, but to be a leader. And so it's perhaps a little bit of embellishment that Captain Miller is using a Thompson submachine gun, but it certainly sets him out in a crowd, and you're able to distinguish him from all of the other men in his squad. And so we thank our producer, Andy, for sharing his Thompson submachine gun here with us for show and tell. The scuffle between Mellish and the German soldier and Upham's inability to intervene has been parodied, dissected, analyzed, agonized over by audiences of all walks of life ever since this movie came out. One really interesting interpretation that I read, which I think is quite compelling, and given that it's Spielberg, I think it makes sense, is that in this sort of confrontation, these three characters are symbolic of broader forces at play. Mellish, of course, is a representative of perhaps the Jewish populations of Europe. The German soldier, of course, is representative of Nazi Germany. Upham is representative of the United States. Despite the fact that this Jewish soldier is in peril, and Upham is completely aware of it, that he is unable or unwilling to intervene in order to save this person's life. And so maybe, just maybe, this is commentary about pre-war America being made by Spielberg, that the United States did not step up, did not intervene, did not prevent this dreadful human catastrophe from taking place, and the Holocaust was able to ensue, and the Jews, in this case Mellish, dies as a consequence from that degree of uncertainty or inability to step up. I thought that was one very artistic interpretation of it, and that's the one I'm going with. And then, of course, at the end, the German is able to walk away without any accountability or repercussions.
We can use them without the tube! How? Use arming water! Set back! Leave it!
There's been a lot of hubbub about the throwing of these mortar shells, and some have claimed that it's not possible. Certainly it's not a safe thing to do, but there is at least one example of something like this happening during World War II. During the Battle of Leyte that occurred in the Pacific Theater, there was a soldier named Buford T. Anderson with the 96th Infantry Division, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his heroics. And part of his Medal of Honor citation reads as such, and I want you to think if this sounds familiar at all with what we're seeing in the film. Securing a box of mortar shells, he extracted the safety pins, banged the bases upon a rock to arm them, and proceeded alternately to hurl shells and fire his piece among the fanatical foe, finally forcing them to withdraw. Despite the protests of his comrades and bleeding profusely from a severe shrapnel wound, he made his way to company command to report the action. And so these sorts of things did not happen with frequency, but they did happen. And therefore we have to rate this moment in Saving Private Ryan as being within the bounds of feasibility. And this is the iconic shot of the movie in my mind. I don't think they needed incentive to run. This final moment of shell shock, Captain Miller he's in this psychological whirlwind. Everything seems to be collapsing around him. He's watching his men fall. All seems lost. They're out of ammunition. Private Ryan is here, screaming like a child. It's such a terrifying moment in the movie. It is so vividly carried out and executed as a piece of filmmaking. It keeps you on the edge of your seat, even well over 2 decades after it comes out. Even if you know the outcome of the movie, by God, you're still rooting for them at the end.
Cat, where the hell are you going? Cat, get back here!
If he'd just stayed on his belly, it would have been okay. The motorcycle that Captain Miller is actually leaning up against here in his final moments is actually a Russian motorcycle. It's a 1963 Ural, so it's about 2 decades off the mark. The sidearm that Captain Miller has with him in his final moments, of course, the 1911. This is a .45 caliber pistol used with great frequency by American troops during World War I, World War II, and beyond. One of the most dependable of sidearms in military history. And although iconic, I don't think it's going to be piercing the armor of that Tiger tank anytime soon. This is not Spielberg's first movie that has incorporated P-51 Mustangs. In his 1987 film, which was his first time looking at World War II in a major motion picture, Empire of the Sun, young Christian Bale lovingly refers to them as Cadillacs of the sky. And indeed, there is a certain sleek style to them that is very representative of the 1940s. In actuality, though, the planes that probably would have been decommissioning these German tanks would have been not P-51s, but P-47s. These were Thunderbolts, and they were the workhorses of American air supremacy in the embattled skies over Normandy. And so they aren't quite as glamorous looking. They look a little bit more plump, I guess is the way to put it. Stylistically, it's certainly understandable why they decided to use the P-51s.
Up him.
In Upham executing Steamboat Willie, I think there's a number of ways that we can dissect this. One is that he has become the thing that he decried earlier in the film. He is executing soldiers. And if we were to think of it in regard to the context of the Holocaust that I mentioned earlier, I think the conclusion to be drawn here is that, like America in the 1940s, he at last realized the evil that was facing him and decided to take action accordingly. That's one interpretation.
James. Earn this.
The line, "earn this," never fails to get me because, on one hand, it's a really cruel thing for Captain Miller to say. That places a horrible weight on Private Ryan's shoulders. This very formidable expectation that he must live to the utmost in his life. On the other hand, it is also a message to we, the audience, that we need to live up to kind of these civic standards, I think we could say, that were set and preserved and fought over by the World War II generation. And we'll ruminate on that a little bit further as we finish up.
Good health and many years of happiness with James at your side. Nothing. Not even the safe.
And I believe the infantrymen who are entering the town here are in fact supposed to be the Ivy men of the 4th Infantry Division. And at places like Sainte-Marie-Église and so many of these other Norman Crossroads town, it was in fact the 4th Division that linked up with the 101st Airborne in so many of these strategic locations. The moment where Private Ryan grows old, we see him aging, is something that really strikes me. Because, in the 1990s, World War II veterans were now in their 70s. They were beginning to pass away in larger numbers. My grandfathers who served in World War II, they passed away when I was 5 and 8. The one who participated in the Normandy landings passed away when I was 5. So suffice it to say, I never had an opportunity to talk with him about his experiences in any meaningful sort of way. And I think I speak for a lot of Americans when I say that this film allowed us to experience those stories kind of vicariously. We may not have gotten to hear all of the stories of our loved ones firsthand, but in the end, this movie gave us a firmer idea of at least some of the experiences that they endured. In no small way, this fact struck me the first time I ever visited the Normandy American Cemetery. It was immediately following a horrible blizzard in March of 2013, and the cemetery had been closed days prior, trees had fallen down, and it was still rainy and ugly even though a lot of the snow had melted. I had this sublime moment in the American Cemetery that we see depicted here in the final moments of the film. Everybody else had gone to the shelter of the visitor center, and I was the only one standing in the cemetery. It was just me and it was them. It was practically a religious experience. And so I can't help but to think of that very emotional moment that I had, and it was on the 20th anniversary of the passing of my grandfather, no less, which heightened those sentiments even further.
Captain John H. Miller.
Tell me I have led a good life.
What a lot of film scholars and historians have mentioned, some have argued that the film would be in fact stronger if there were not these sentimental bookends at the beginning and the end of the film with the older Private Ryan, because to an extent, this almost syrupy, I think we could say, formula that is used here, it's very asynchronous and out of lock with the rest of the film, which is very unsentimental, very unpatriotic, very cynical, and a dark look at human nature. As the old saying goes, balance in all things, and certainly Steven Spielberg knows how to strike the right emotional chords here at the end. Because I think inevitably, when a lot of Americans went to see this movie in 1998, at the very end, they saw not Private Ryan, but they saw their own dads and their own grandfathers. And I think that is why the ending worked so well from a cinematic standpoint, even though some of the cinematic and historical elements of it may also be problematic. There are a multitude of legacies to this film, and it opens up the door to all sorts of questions. This movie happens to be the favorite film of President George W. Bush, and it leads one to think, does this film reinforce his idea of the United States as a liberating military force? Does this sort of nostalgia for the 1940s compel him to launch the invasion of Iraq in 2003? These are some of the really interesting cultural and political components in regards to the legacies of Saving Private Ryan that I think are worthwhile for us to think about. As far as veteran reactions to the film go, the praise seemed almost universal. Veterans of D-Day said that, this was the most accurate depictions of battle that they had ever seen before. So trying and so traumatic were some of the scenes that the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs had to open up essentially a help hotline for World War II veterans and perhaps other veterans who suddenly had to cope and come to realization with their traumas of the past. One veteran who was not beguiled by the many charms of Saving Private Ryan is one of my favorite veteran writers, a gentleman by the name of Paul Fussell, whose excellent book Wartime, I think, is the best psychological snapshot of the American GI in that conflict. And this is what he had to write about Saving Private Ryan in 2001. He wrote, "I couldn't put out of my mind the way Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, after an honest, harrowing 15-minute opening visualizing details of the unbearable bloody mess at Omaha Beach, degenerated into a harmless, uncritical, patriotic performance apparently designed to thrill 12-year-old boys during the summer bad film season. Its genre was pure cowboys and Indians with virtuous cowboys, of course victorious." And I think that there is a degree of truth to that review that is, worthy of our attention, because certainly there are many elements of Saving Private Ryan, especially in its second half, that delve into many a war movie trope. By contrast, Major Dick Winters, who himself was about to get the Hollywood treatment via Band of Brothers in 2001, took an alternative view to Saving Private Ryan. He wrote to over 100 friends, encouraging them to go see it. He was a big cheerleader of Stephen Ambrose's books, which were big sources of inspiration for Saving Private Ryan. This is what Dick Winters had to say to a reporter who was interviewing him on the topic. He said, "It's hard to talk to someone who wasn't there. It's not just the memories. They don't know what questions to ask," he explained to the Los Angeles Times. He felt that audiences would get a better perspective of 1940s combat by seeing this film. And he concludes, "After they've seen it, they'll know why I came home after the war and insisted we buy a farm for peace and quiet." And so Dick Winters was of the mind that even with all of its warts and all of its flaws, Saving Private Ryan was a meaningful benchmark to engaging a broader audience in conversation about the experiences of his generation in the war. And in that regard, the movie succeeded with flying colors. As we conclude this very lengthy breakdown of Saving Private Ryan, thank you so much for sticking with us, by the way. I'm once again called back or reminded of Captain Miller's final words of "earn this." What exactly is he saying, and what exactly is he implying? I think the best way for me to answer that is to reflect upon the words that Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stated when he revisited Normandy 20 years later in 1964. He was standing over the Normandy American Cemetery. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, who himself was a war correspondent, was at his side and looking over all of the tombstones, all of the crosses and stars of David that Saving Private Ryan concludes with. Dwight Eisenhower said these words. He declared,
"I devoutly hope that we will never again have to see such scenes as these. I think and hope, pray, that humanity has learned more than we had learned up to that time. But these people gave us a chance, and they bought time for us so that we can do better than we have before."
And all of these decades later, as we consider the fictitious words of "earn this" by Captain Miller, and we contrast them with the real-life words of Dwight D. Eisenhower, all of these years later, we still must wonder and ponder, how do we earn this? What do we owe the dead? What are we going to do with that chance that they gave us? And I think that that is the eternal question that both history and this film require us to ask of ourselves. So before we conclude, I'm going to give you some homework, as I often do, and do some recommended reading. And the first of which is The Bedford Boys by historian Alex Kershaw. This is a great meditation upon soldiers who were predominantly from the Bedford, Virginia area, who were members of the 29th Infantry Division. And, you know, it shows us how war can inflict its terrible toll on a single hometown and single families. And a lot of the narrative describing Omaha Beach within this book overlaps wonderfully with the depictions that we see in Saving Private Ryan. Our next book is a book called Rangers Lead the Way, and this is a great account of first-hand interviews chronicling the exploits of the various Ranger battalions with specific focus, a considerable focus, dedicated to those who participated in the Normandy invasion. Last but not least, we have my book, which is Dispatches of D-Day, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion. A lot of the information that I shared during our commentary in this episode derives from the original research that I did for this book. And what I did is I went through 150 different American newspapers transcribed 300,000 words of Normandy battlefront reports and letters, and I pulled what I thought were the best and most revealing of them to stitch together this mosaic of the American experience in the spring of 1944. And so if you like good first-hand stories, I'd recommend my own Dispatches of D-Day. If you are interested in supporting us in other ways, there are a number of methods in which you can do so. The easiest of which is to hit that subscribe button here at the bottom of our video, help our channel grow, help us build new audiences, and have more outreach with our great creative content. You can also become a Patreon supporter, and that has all sorts of additional benefits, including inside scoops, previews, one-on-one conversations, and so much more. And as a Patreon supporter, you can also watch all of our videos ad-free. And last but not least, you can also buy some classy historical apparel on the Real History Teespring website. And much of those proceeds go to support the growth of this channel. You can find all of that and much, much more on our website at realhistoryfilms.com. And one of the great perks of that website is that there are all sorts of educational resources that are optimal for classroom use. Particularly in regard to this film, you can find an accompanying set of classroom questions, discussion points, and primary resources that are absolutely wonderful for students to have access to. If you're looking for a more immediate way to help us out, we welcome you to leave a super thanks comment below. So be sure to comment, like, subscribe, stick around, explore our other platforms. We have a lot more content coming up here on Real History, and we thank you so much for tuning in on this episode, which I suspect will be our longest yet published. So thanks once again, and we'll see you next time.